Okay, so Ben Wallace, for those of you who don't know, is the defense secretary in the United Kingdom, right? He is seen by most Ukrainians very positively, right? And the reason he's seen very positively is he's one of the strongest voices within the United Kingdom in favor of sending aid to Ukraine, strong, like a large amount of aid to Ukraine, pushing the boundaries on things like Storm Shadow. He's in support of Storm Shadow. Long-range missiles, very helpful to Ukrainians in current counteroffensive. And he's respected, broadly speaking, by both sides of the political aisle. And when I say that, I don't mean to say that he's perfect. I don't mean to say that I agree with him politically. I mean to say that Keir Starmer's government and Rishi Sunak's government don't hate him. And so if you are the Ukrainians, that means keeping this guy's favor, or this guy, like, supporting you is good. It's a good thing. He has favor with a lot of British politicians, has a lot of sway, and he's somebody who's pretty aggressive on supporting Ukraine. But recently, Ben Wallace said some weird stuff. He called for more gratitude from Ukraine. Such a weird. Oh no, the Reuters limit. Come on, here it is. Ukraine must show gratitude to the West to keep support, UK Defense Minister warns. Ben Wallace cautioned that Kiev should rein in its disappointment over NATO's language on joining the alliance. So we're going to talk about this next segment, right? But quickly, a rundown just so you know what's happening. A big thing that a lot of Ukraine supporters, including myself, wanted going into the Lithuanian NATO Summit in Vilnius was a timetable for how Ukraine's going to join NATO. I was never under the delusion, and I know some people asked this, but I was never under the delusion that Ukraine was going to join NATO during the war. I understand that NATO has rules, and allowing a nation state to join while it is actively at war means you'll probably be dragged into that war, and they're at war with the nuclear power, and so that needs to be considered. And so my viewpoint is support them, and once the war is over, then you start the process for them to formally join NATO. They should already be starting the integration when it comes to weapon systems, stuff like that. But when it comes to, like, the documents and, like, the bureaucracy level of it, that should be done once they're done with the war, and then they join NATO. And so you can have a timetable that aligns with that vaguely. But there was no joining of NATO at the summit, which no one expected. But there was also no timetable. There was no timetable put forward by the United States, put forward by anyone. And this was purposeful from many of our Ukraine's Western allies, including the United States, as they didn't want to make this formalized. Now, to me, what it feels like is that the Biden administration and others, while everyone seems to be saying, including Ben Wallace, and we're going to listen to him talk about this in a moment, because I do have a video of him answering some tough questions from a Ukrainian MP. It seems like they want to have some wiggle room for negotiations with the Russians, so that maybe, in return for the Russians giving something in negotiations later on, they could say, okay, maybe Ukraine won't join NATO, but we're going to have the United States and the United Kingdom make defensive agreements with them, but they're going to stay outside of NATO. That's what it feels like. That's the vibe that I'm getting. Of course, I can't be in Joe Biden's mind. Everybody in the Biden administration, everybody in the Rishi Sunak's administration, everybody in all of the major NATO states seem to be saying that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. But if it is a question of when, and it's not a question of if, and there isn't any flexibility with this on the Russians, and I've all agreed that NATO should include Ukraine at this point, which is something that I believe, then where's the timetable? Why can't we make a timetable? I want a timetable, because this is the thing that Ukrainians are scared of, and this is a really valid fear. In 2008 is when the first declaration was made that the future of Ukraine was probably in NATO, and that NATO said that they wanted Ukraine in, and they saw that their future was with Ukraine. That doesn't mean the formalized process went through. That doesn't mean they did all the paperwork. That doesn't mean they did weapons integration or systems integration or any of that. It was just a verbal statement. And then that was that. For the next, what? 12, 13, 14 years. Nothing. They didn't get at all close to joining NATO. And ever since they were invaded in 2014, it's been stalled. And so Ukrainians remember that in 2008 and know that 6 years after that commitment was made, Russia invaded Ukraine. And then 8 to 9 years after that, Russia invaded Ukraine again. And they want a timetable because they do not want this war to end and then them to be, up shit creek without a paddle, no commitment to join NATO, just a vague commitment of, oh, you eventually join NATO, but it's not set in stone. And so the can continue to get kicked down the road until the Russians lick their wounds and then they invade again. That's something Ukrainians don't want. And so Zelensky was not happy. Can we actually pull up this? Let's pull up the Zelensky, the Zelensky tweet. Let's pull that up. Zelensky, can we? Oh my God, I don't even want to know what David Sachs had to say about it. Where's his Twitter account? I want to, because he released a statement on Twitter, so I wanted to show that statement on Twitter. Is this it? No, that's not it. Where is it? Here it is. Okay. I wanted to see his Twitter about the summit in Vilnius. Where is it? Where's the original statement? Man, there's so many different tweets, but what was the one that he was not happy? That's the one I'm looking for. Where is it? You know what? Maybe we can just read this first. Ukraine must show gratitude to its allies, despite disappointment over the way NATO framed Kiev's future membership prospects. Actually, no, we have to read his statement first before we see Ben Wallace saying that they're ungrateful. Does anybody know where Zelensky's statement was? Zelensky, NATO timeline statement. Here it is. Zelensky slams NATO for admitting a timeline for Ukraine to join. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Tuesday jolted a summit of NATO leaders by blasting their joint statement on his country's prospective membership, decrying its lack of concrete timelines as unprecedented and absurd. In a fiery tweet, Zelensky frustrated Ukraine's advocates inside the alliance who believed they had secured a win for Kiev by pushing the United States, Germany, and other reluctant countries to consent to an extended invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met. In the words of the declaration, painstakingly hammered out the negotiations amongst the 31 NATO members. Ukraine has demanded a definitive timeline for NATO membership that includes specific steps and milestones, but many NATO countries are cautious about risking direct war with Russia, and they have been searching for a way to balance Ukraine's hopes with pragmatic security calculations. Zelensky's angry intervention, which came before the final agreement on Tuesday, but after the language had already started circulating, suggested the alliance had not yet found a way to satisfy both sides. NATO diplomats had hoped to issue a unified declaration on Ukraine's membership prospects on Tuesday at a triumphal moment ahead of Zelensky's visit to the summit. The sharp statement was the latest. Wait, where is the statement? Here it is. Now, on the way to Vilnius, we received signals that certain wording is being discussed without Ukraine. And I would like to emphasize that this wording is about the invitation to become a NATO member, not about Ukraine's membership. It's unprecedented and absurd when the time frame is not set neither for the invitation nor for Ukraine's membership. He claimed that NATO leaders were not serious about inviting Ukraine to join the alliance and complained that their approach indicated they instead wanted to keep its membership as a bargaining chip for eventual negotiations with Russia. Uncertainty is weakness, he wrote, as he prepared to join the allies for the meeting in Vilnius, and I will openly discuss this at the summit. Zelensky's blunt 170-word Twitter missive surprised policymakers at the summit, where Biden had hoped to lead a show of unity against Russia and highlight his ability to rally global partners. So I believe his argument is solid. I believe Zelensky's argument is solid. Now, I've heard other people's argument of, if you make this a red line in the sand, it might be harder for Putin to find an off-ramp. I understand the argument, but I would like a red line stopping a future Russian invasion. And the only thing that we have on the table that is a provable red line right now for sure that has worked in Europe is NATO membership. It worked for the Poles, it worked for the Estonians, it worked for the Lithuanians, it worked for the Latvians. I don't think it would be that crazy to make this commitment. And I actually think, with the amount of pressure that the Russian regime is under right now, that digging our heels in the sand and saying just blatantly, Ukraine's going to join NATO once the war's over. I think that might be the right thing to do. I think that that pressures the Russians. I think that sends a strong signal to the Ukrainians. We have a plan, so we have a concrete plan, so we're not going to kick the can down the road. And then when this war is settled, it means it will be the last war. It will be the last war that the Russians have with the Ukrainians if they're part of NATO once this is all over. Now, I am not 100% tied to it. You mean a timeline? Yes, I mean a timeline. I'm not 100% tied to it because I do think there's other ways to go about it, like the United States guaranteeing Ukraine with the United Kingdom or a bunch of like-minded countries doing it individually. If that deal had to be made in order to get the Russians out, I don't think the Ukrainians would not make that deal if they had to, right? So I don't know if I'm like 100% committed to it, but if the Ukrainians see that as the best path forward to them, a good way to pressure the Russians, I do think you need to have a good answer to them. If the statement currently is not, well, it's still in the air, because that's what Western officials are saying. Ben Wallace isn't saying, oh, actually, it's still in the air, it's still negotiable. So if it's no longer negotiable, if Ukraine is in NATO, or is going to be in NATO, which is what Western officials across the board seem to be saying, it's not a question of when, it's a question, not a question of if, it's a question of when, then write out the timeline, make that as clear as day, and so we know we have a plan set in place that when this war is over, to stop Ukraine ever being invaded again. Because if not, you're just sending mixed messages. You're saying, well, on one hand, you know, Ukraine is going to be a part of NATO, but also we're willing to negotiate them not being a part of NATO. It's just, you're sending mixed messages. I don't know. I don't like it. Anyway, Ben Wallace responded to this, which I think is pretty valid criticism, if I'm being completely honest with you, by saying, Ukraine must show gratitude to its allies despite its disappointment over the way NATO framed Kiev's future membership prospects in order to maintain long-term Western public and political support, the British Defense Secretary warned on Wednesday. Speaking to reporters at the NATO Summit in Vilnius, Ben Wallace cautioned that the United States is heading for a presidential election next year, and lawmakers from countries making big military donations to Kiev could face a political problem if they are met with Ukrainian anger. This is concern across Europe that NATO skeptic Donald Trump could return as a U.S. president. Sometimes you have to persuade lawmakers on the Hill in America. You have to persuade doubting politicians in other countries that you know that it's worth it, and it's worthwhile, and they are getting something for it. And whether you like it or not, that's the reality of it. Okay, so. Okay, wait. Let's keep reading. There's more here. Some U.S. lawmakers, Wallace continued, complained about the support provided by Washington to Kiev. Sometimes you would hear grumbles not from the administration and the American system, but you would hear them from lawmakers on the Hill. We're giving $83 billion worth or whatever. We are not Amazon. The defense secretary added he advised the Ukrainian government to take this into account. There's a slight word of caution here, which is, whether you like it or not, people want to see gratitude. The win here for Ukraine is a sort of cultural acceptance that Ukraine belongs to NATO. The word belongs implies fate, and it implies it's going to happen. It is not an if, it is a when. Okay, so we're going to watch Ben Wallace talk about this in a moment, but I just want to talk about this idea of gratitude. How old is Ben Wallace? How long has Ben Wallace been in British politics? I want to know this, because I want to know if this reference, will really connect with him. He's 53. He was born in 19. Well, then if he's been paying attention to politics, then he should know this. If he thinks that this is too brutal from the Ukrainians. He should have seen the polls in the early 2000s when they started to think that the window for NATO was closing. They should have seen the Czechs in the same time period, the Czech Republic, when they thought the window for NATO was closing. I wonder if he would have said they weren't showing proper enough gratitude by jumping and being as aggressive as they were and being as hard of an advocate for themselves as they were. Zelensky is somebody who has a lot of experience in the media and has very, I would say, effectively used the Ukrainian media space, used his position as their head of state to go out into the world and advocate on behalf of Ukraine, gather aid, and raise awareness. Him being angry that they don't have a timeline for NATO membership when it's been since 13 years since the 2008 declaration was made that Ukraine's future was in NATO? And in that time frame, how much progress has been made? Most of the progress has only been made since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. I think it is perfectly reasonable for them to see that history of what happened in 2008, see how NATO kind of abandoned Ukraine in 2014, in large part, and says, look, we want a date commitment. We want a commitment saying that these many days, 100 days after the war is over, we will be part of NATO. Or that 100 days after this commitment is met, we will join NATO. Because some people might say, well, 100 days after the war is over, what if they haven't hit the standard by then? Then you could do it by the standard, saying, once you've hit this standard, then you can join NATO. Any of these things, putting that out there. Now, there is one counter to this argument that I thought had some validity. If the Russians know that immediately once the war is over, Ukraine is going to join NATO, they could have an incentive to try to keep the war going on as long as possible. A solution to that, though, would be make it expensive for the Russians to keep the war going on as long as possible. If their ammo depots are exploding, if their soldiers are getting killed en masse, if their offensives are failing, if they're getting drone striked, if they're getting shelled, if they're getting ambushed, it's going to be very difficult for them to, finance that war. The problem with just like randomly shelling into one country, like definitely Ukraine now, is that it can also shell you back. So I don't know how seriously I take that concern, especially if the plan to admit Ukraine into NATO and having a date for it, which they've already said in principle that Ukraine is going to join NATO. So I already think that this point is void anyway, since the statement's already been made. The Ukraine will join NATO. It's a question of if not when. Just knowing that when, I think, is going to be very important for Ukrainian strategic planning and Ukrainian peace of mind. And that's what I really want to emphasize, is Ukrainians want to know that this is the last big struggle, that this is the last struggle with Russian imperialism, and that is Zelensky's role in history. At least that's what he has said. I don't know if you guys ever read like Zelensky's more personal interviews, but in a more personal interview, Zelensky has said that he views his role in history as usurping Russian occupation in Russia, that this is supposed to be the last war with a multi-generational struggle against Russian occupation. And if you don't have a win commitment on paper, in writing, permanently down, then you don't know for sure that this is it. And I think that's Ukraine's main concern. And I don't think that they're being uppity or they're being snooty by being aggressive on this point. When you're fighting for the lives of all of your people against the war of annihilation, being a little aggressive in your language, I think is perfectly warranted. And if Rishi Sunak, Ben Wallace, Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Erdogan, Olaf Scholz, any of these other people, any of the people in NATO or Western officials were in the same position Zelensky was in, I have a weird feeling they'd probably be doing something very similar. Anyway, let's listen to what Ben Wallace had to say in response to this Ukrainian MP. I think this is a Ukrainian MP.
Member of the Parliament of...
Yep, he is an MP. God, I can recognize these guys just by looking at them now. Okay, let's watch.
Alexei Goncharенko, Member of the Parliament of Ukraine. You said about...
I remember because he posted a video about the flooding in Kherson. That's why I remember him.
Oleksiy Goncharenko, member of the Parliament of Ukraine. You said about today we're waiting for the security guarantees, but the problem for Ukraine is that we already had it. It was called Budapest Memorandum, and the United Kingdom was one of the parties of these guarantees. And we now know what had happened. Nuclear Russia attacked our country. So now to fill this security vacuum that we have, it looks like we have just three ways. First of them, to become member of NATO with a nuclear powers in it. Unfortunately, after yesterday's decision, it looks uncertain, and we can't understand when it will happen. Number two, if one of the nuclear powers will deploy nuclear weaponry on our territory, Russia is deploying in Belarus. Why, for example, the United Kingdom or the United States can't deploy it in Ukraine?
Dude, okay, I have to say, this guy right here, now, if you're Ukrainian, that might not sound like the craziest thing to you, but saying that to any politician, they're gonna completely disregard this. Who is this bozo? He's an elected Ukrainian MP. I only know him from his video recording in Kherson, and him wearing like a shirt that said like Kuban is Ukraine or something, which I think is I don't know. It seemed like just a joke, but I hope it was just a joke. But I don't know anything else about him. I have heard from some people that he is a little I could say quirky, maybe is the way to put it.
On a bilateral basis. And the third opportunity is to restore our own nuclear arsenal. So what do you think about this? Thank you very much.
First of all, there is a danger that we're undermining this communique, right? So I think you're wrong on your reading of the communique, right? I think it's my fourth or fifth NATO summit, right? I have watched the Ukraine conflict emerge at first hand. I believe that what the communique really says and what the Secretary General says, this is a matter of when, right? We've crossed the other bridges that used to exist. There were nations.
But if this is the thing that gets me, because right now what he's saying is a commitment that Ukraine will be in NATO. So then there's not a question about wiggle room then if we're saying that Ukraine will be in NATO, unless because you haven't put down a timeline, then maybe this is something you can maybe move off of or move back to. Because if there's not a timeline and you move off of it, it will be less embarrassing if you move off of it. And that's what Ukrainians fear, that without there being some formalized timeline, once the war ends, maybe the Russians can negotiate you out of it. And now they've gone through all of this struggle just for them to leave the war without large-scale security guarantee like Article 5.
Who genuinely would say, well, if and should Ukraine really, does it really belong in NATO? I think we have crossed that bridge. The question is a debate about when, and Ukraine is absolutely right to press us on when there should be a timetable for Ukraine to join. So I don't read your interpretation the way you do. I read it, and you know, my Dutch colleague said 33. There you are. There's another example of the when, right? So I do believe there will be a time in the nearest future, once we have helped you through this conflict, that Ukraine will join NATO, right? Secondly, look, I'm not going to comment on a sovereign state's decisions or what it wants to do or needs to do to defend itself. You know, Britain.
We should not put nukes in Ukraine. That's my official position. I don't like if we would have put nukes in Ukraine right now. I don't think that would stop the Russians. It didn't stop Wagner from invading Russia. I don't think it would stop the Russians at this point. Nukes are more of a it's supposed to stop someone from doing things in the first place. Supposed to stop people from invading in the first place. Deploying them now, they've already done the invasion. Not to mention deploying nukes in a country that's actively being invaded. I don't know. I don't know if it's the safest nuclear policy.
Is a nuclear weapons state. I'm not going to sit here and be hypocritical, but I also know the best thing I could do is stay on this stage, do this, this, and this, and President Putin will lap it up and say, you see, all along my fears are correct. You know, people are going to threaten Russia and et cetera, and that is not a game I'm going to play for President Putin.
Smart.
Okay, so I also think.
I mean, what do you think he should have said? Yes, if they would have put nukes in, they would have taken that clip and they would have played it on repeat over and over and over and over. Look what the British Defense Secretary said about nukes on our border. That it would have been that. Yeah, I just don't assist the propaganda machine. That was smart.
That, look, you're right on the Budapest Memorandum, right? You're right in Minsk, okay? And, you know, I think one of the reasons the international community is so determined to help Ukraine be successful and Russia be defeated in this conflict is partly to right some of the wrongs, okay? I mean, I can't turn back time. I wish I had a time machine, okay? And I'm sure if Ukraine had a time machine, they probably wouldn't have turned up in Budapest, right? They would have said, tough, right? But remember, we have watched Putin go on a journey. Now, some of you in this room from Eastern Europe would have said he was always going to be like that, right? And some of you who know Russia better than I will ever know Russia will say that's what Russia is. But for many people in the West, they watch Putin go on a journey, and his journey has ended up where he is now. And I think there were, I mean, I even remember Putin muting whether he might want to join NATO back in the early 2000s, right? So
2002.
Luckily he didn't. But I think that journey led people to make decisions that I think we either regret or he has now himself reneged on. And he's the one who's broken the Budapest, effectively, agreement. But ultimately, you know, I don't think you should doubt that this NATO summit is all about helping Ukraine win in Ukraine against Russia, defeating Russia in Ukraine, and giving Ukraine the security it requires for its future to be prosperous and successful.
Okay, well, we are out of time.
Okay. I like defense secretaries answering questions like this because that wasn't a super he's not even like a reporter, he's like a politician, and it was a super kind of curveball question, like the idea of Ukraine getting back its nuclear arsenal. But I appreciate them taking less than filtered questions. I appreciate that. I like when government officials do that.